The monumental flooding and humanitarian disaster continues to unfold after Harvey, with some areas receiving over 51 inches of rain, a record in the continental U.S. Official rescue teams are overwhelmed, and now more civilian groups pitching in.
Some of you probably came out here thinking that you'd be doing sexy, kick-ass type stuff, and you ended up getting stuck in houses that are all nearing the end of construction phases. A lot of detailed work, right? We want to try to make sure that when they go back into that house, that chapter in their book of Harvey can finally close, and they can move on to the next one.
It's so easy for us to forget people after that initial response. It's so easy for everybody who is lucky enough like me to live far away from high natural disaster rate areas to forget and say, I'm just going to keep going on with my life. I sent my $50 and now it's over.
After all of the initial help leaves an area, we've stuck behind. We are going to go help the people who got forgotten. Even me, who I was surrounded by other people that I was serving with, I was forgotten. And after having retired from the police force and having left the military, I was starting to feel, I really wanted to get back to America and have a life, right? Friends, family, community, all of that I don't have. But I had no way to do that. I saw a commercial for the Houston rebuild, and I said, that's the kind of thing that I need. So I started looking more into Team Rubicon, and then I saw the Clay Hunt Fellowship, and I read Clay's story. Because at that point in my life, I had pretty much decided I wasn't coming home. I think kind of the way that Clay felt. I had actually already had a plan, like a suicide plan, basically, and just kind of at peace with that, to be totally honest. And the Clay Hunt Fellowship program has given me my life back.
So the hardest part for me when I was getting out was, I think with most of us, was finding camaraderie. Team Rubicon has given me that.
My transition from my military brothers to, now my brothers and sisters of Team Rubicon, it's been amazing.
Every person you meet here is passionate and excited to work and will do anything for anybody.
It doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, what your political, religious, none of those views matter when you're together as a family like we are.
We have a phrase that I can't really use. The acronym is GSD, and gray shirts know what that means. But a motivated gray shirt can accomplish most anything.
If you don't mind me asking, what is GSD?
Get shit done.
People are still suffering every day, and they're just like our neighbors in our nice, safe community. And so we need to find a better way to activate our communities and get them involved again.
If they don't have you guys taking a week out of your time, flying out here from every corner in the country to come here and work for free, people don't get to go back home. It is because of that I tell you guys every day how much I love you.
Please welcome to the stage founder and CEO of Team Rubicon, Jake Wood.
All right. Good morning, Groundbreak. That was a hell of a video.
Just saw it for the first time last night. I want to recognize a couple of the stars of that video. We have some of the members of the rebuild team down in Houston, Texas, over here off to the left hand of the stage. Would you all please stand up real quick? Give them a round of applause. All right, sit down. Now, these folks right here have dedicated their personal and professional lives to rebuilding the city of Houston after Harvey. We have a booth out there in the exposition hall. I'd encourage you to stop by the Team Rubicon booth, hear their story, learn how we're using Procore, learn how we're investing in our military veterans to develop within them the necessary skills to run a construction program like that, learn how we're taking these incredible human beings and making them employable by all of you out there in this industry. With that being said, I'll go ahead and get started here. It's such a pleasure to join you here in Phoenix. I'm not here just to talk about the Team Rubicon story, though I would love nothing more than to sit up here for the next hour and tell you some of the incredible things that this organization has accomplished along the way. I'm really here to talk about how we have managed to do what we do. How have we built an organization that is capable of responding to some of the worst circumstances around the globe in some of the toughest conditions imaginable, and do that time and time again, over 400 times, in fact, over the last decade, bringing aid to people in their worst times. The lessons that we've learned, both on the battlefield and in the disaster zones, are transferable to any organization, regardless of sector, regardless of industry. And so before I begin, I want us to accept this simple premise. And that premise is that the world is fast-moving and full of uncertainty. I probably don't need to convince you of this. It doesn't matter if it's a financial crisis like the one that crippled the construction industry back in 2008. It could be a trade war. It could be an errant tweet by our president that attacks a company by name. It could be a terrorist attack. It could be anything, a cyber attack, anything that you imagine. The world is moving more quickly today than at any time in our history. It's driven by technological advances. It's driven by demographic and societal shifts. Okay? So if we can accept this as a premise, then what that helps us to understand is how do we build organizations? How do we develop teams? And how do we build organizational cultures that helps us to navigate and conquer this uncertainty? About 6 weeks ago, I returned from the Bahamas. I joined our team on the ground there. Our team deployed into the Bahamas onto Abaco Island about 24 hours after that hurricane passed. I joined them about 3 days later just to see the situation on the ground. One of our teams that was operating a drone to help conduct some reconnaissance of roadways on the island took this footage. This is as chaotic and uncertain an environment as you will ever find on the planet. A lack of resources, a lack of information, complete devastation. Not just a lack of information, but total misinformation and disinformation, right? Limited resources, complex logistics, trying to get the resources that you need from Florida or from Nassau into the facility because the airfields are shut down, the ports are shut down. So how is it that Team Rubicon approaches an environment like this? Well, I imagine that we're all leaders on our teams here, and as good leaders, what do? We plan, right? And if we're really good leaders, we have a backup plan. And if we're great leaders, we've got a backup plan for our backup plan, right? Now, I imagine that you all do your strategic planning. I imagine that you all have plans and contingency plans for every situation and environment that you imagine that you might run into. And you probably then know that when the circumstances change, it's not as simple as going to the shelf and pulling that plan off and dusting it off, opening it up, and following some script that you wrote 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. Now, there's value in the planning process. It helps us to identify our resources. It helps us to identify our strengths, our weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats that we face. But planning in and of itself is not the solution for managing the chaos that we find ourselves facing on a nearly daily basis. Now, to drive that point home, I want to bring up one of the really great American philosophers. You know, most people, when they think of great American thinkers, they think of, Thoreau or Edison or Franklin. I want to bring up my man, Mike Tyson. One of the more underrated thinkers of the 20th century. Mike Tyson said this about plans: everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? I think this more or less sums up the environment that we're in. This is very similar to what General Patton once said about warfare. He said, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. Okay? The moment the bullets start flying, battle plans go out the window. So then, how do we conquer that uncertainty that we face? Well, to talk about that, I want to bring up an actual philosopher. This is Heraclitus. Heraclitus lived about 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. He had this parable that he'd like to use about the 100 men that go into battle. And it goes like this. For every 100 men that go into battle, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are nothing more than sheep. 9 are the real fighters, and we're lucky to have them because they make the battle. But one is the warrior, and it's his or her job to bring all the others home. Let's unpack that for a second. So Heraclitus talks about these 100 people that go into battle. And he starts off by saying that there's 10 that shouldn't even be there. That's not a very nice thing to say, right? We all know who these people are that Heraclitus is talking about. In the Marine Corps, where I served, we had a name for these people. We called them oxygen thieves, okay? You'd kind of look at these folks and you'd be like, man, I'm surprised you actually made it this far. Like, you're alive. Congratulations. Like, this is stunning. Now, listen, these are not bad folks. By no means are these bad people, but they are bad fits for our organizations. These are people that they don't add lift, they only add drag. So how do we make sure that we're setting up systems, that we're setting up culture that doesn't even allow these people into our organizations and onto our teams to begin with? Now, Heraclitus then talks about the 80. And he's actually not that much more kind to the 80. He calls these 80 the sheep. And he doesn't mean that in some nice Judeo-Christian sense. He means this in the mindless flock mentality sense. And we know who these people are too, right? These are those clock punchers in our organizations, those people who show up a few minutes late every single day. It takes them 10 minutes to pop open that laptop, 20 minutes to brew a pot of coffee, and they can never even get the coffee right? And then 10 minutes before 5 o'clock, they're packing up their laptop and they're getting ready to go home. Now, these aren't bad folks either, right? These are not bad people. And more likely than not, these are incredibly talented people who have not had their passions ignited within the leadership or the culture of that organization. They're waiting for somebody to invest in them. They're waiting for someone to believe in them. They're waiting for someone to challenge them to become the better versions of themselves at work. How do we do that? How do we unlock that biggest group that Heraclitus talks about, and move them from that 80 and into the 9? How do we wring out of them that talent, that passion, that fire, that productivity that is somewhere deep within inside them? How do we build a culture that accomplishes that in our organizations? And then it gets really interesting. Heraclitus next talks about these 9. And he says, these 9, we're lucky to have them because they're the fighters and they make the battle. Now, we know who these people are. I hope that everybody in here is among those 9, regardless of what your title is. These are the people that we can count on to accomplish any task, execute any mission, regardless of the resources they have, regardless of the challenges that they face, regardless of the information they do or don't possess. These are the people that you throw an opportunity or a threat at, and you walk away confident that in a week, when you check in, it'll be taken care of. And when you check back in a week, if it didn't happen, if it didn't get taken care of, you can rest easy knowing that they exhausted every possibility. No stone was left unturned, and that it ultimately just maybe wasn't possible. How do we find these types of people? How do we recruit and bring these individuals on our team? How do we align them to a vision so that they're walking forward in lockstep, in unison? How do we inspire these people to be more? And then finally, Heraclitus talks about this one. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because he calls this one the warrior. But he doesn't talk about this warrior's prowess in battle. He doesn't talk about how big he is, how fast she is, how fierce a fighter the warrior is. What's he talk about? He talks about that warrior's sacred responsibility to bring all the others home. How do we aspire to be that type of leader in our organizations, regardless of our title or of our role? How do we be that type of person that others turn to in times of chaos to lead them through it? The type of person that others can count on, who say, I'm going to follow you regardless of circumstance, because I trust that you're going to do everything that you can to take care of me. How do we become that individual? So we're going to use this construct, this framework of the 1 and the 9 to talk about building teams and developing culture and becoming leaders for about the next 40 minutes. And to make this more interesting, I'm going to use stories to help shape that conversation. Some of these are going to be my personal stories. Some of these are going to be the stories of our organization. I'll start with a personal story from about 30 years ago. 30 years ago, my family moved to Europe. My dad had a job in manufacturing. We moved to Austria in 1989. It was a really fascinating time to be living in Europe. You know, the Berlin Wall was coming down. The Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. From 100 miles from our front door in Austria, that things were just happening that were just so massive. And I was a young boy, and I have to admit, I didn't quite grasp everything that was going on around me, but I knew that big fundamental things were taking place. One weekend, my family took us, my sisters and I, to this place. This is Mauthausen. It was a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, and it's in northern Austria. It was one of the most formative experiences of my life. For one, at Mauthausen, I learned for the first time what true evil was. When you're a 7-year-old boy, evil is Wile E. Coyote, right? It's a cartoon character that's trying to catch a roadrunner and failing miserably time and time and time again every 15 minutes. And here, I was able to actually put my arm into ovens that had burned the bodies of kids my age. That'll fundamentally change a 7-year-old. The most important lesson, I think, that I learned that weekend or that day was when we saw the exhibit of the liberation of the camp. When we saw these photographs of these American men who'd sailed across an ocean to go and fight on lands that they'd never been for people they'd never met, who marched across Europe to liberate the last surviving prisoners of Mauthausen. It was in that moment that I realized the type of person that I wanted to be, right? The type of person that stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, the type of person who lived a life of conviction. And so I became that kid. My family moved back to the United States a couple years later. I grew up in the Midwest. And growing up, I always aspired to join the military. That was my life's purpose. I felt that calling to serve my country and serve a cause that was bigger than myself. In high school, I would speak to the recruiters. I started my applications to West Point and the Naval Academy. And then sometime between my sophomore and my junior year, I hit a growth spurt. I grew 4 or 5 inches. I put on 30 or 40 pounds. I had an all-state football season my junior year, and suddenly these college football coaches were coming, sitting in my living room. They were offering me scholarships to come and play at their universities. And so when I was 18, I had this choice to make. I could follow this life's purpose that I'd had for the previous 10 years, that I'd been spent all of my childhood dreaming and aspiring to, or I could make this other decision. I could pursue something that was a little bit more selfish, that was a little bit more about me. I could go play, on one of college football's greatest stages. I could pursue a career in the NFL and go get rich and all of those things. And listen, I was really lucky. I had a great family. I had parents that raised me right. I was a mature young man. And so I made the only choice that a mature young 18-year-old can make, and I decided to go play football. I ended up taking a scholarship to the University of Wisconsin. Listen, this was a bad choice. I ended up being a pretty terrible football player. But I was blessed to play for the Wisconsin Badgers, for Barry Alvarez, a Hall of Fame football coach. And I learned a lot in my 4 years in Madison. I learned a lot about teamwork and hard work and humility and all of these things that you learn playing a team sport at the highest level. I wouldn't take any of that back from that decision. And the most important lesson that I learned in my 4 years on campus happened my freshman year. I woke up one morning, I was going to practice, and I walked into the cafeteria to get some food before I left for the stadium. And I saw all my classmates kind of huddled around a TV, and I walked up behind them, and I watched the second plane hit the World Trade Center. We all remember where we were when that happened, right? I'm not unique in that regard. I'm not the only person that ended up signing up into the military because of that day. Some of my colleagues here were already in uniform when that happened. But in that moment where I saw 9/11 unfolding, I knew I'd made the wrong choice. And I had only made it 9 months prior, but I already knew I'd made the wrong choice, and I was at the wrong place on the wrong campus. And so what did I do? I got some food and I went to practice. And we went and we played Penn State that weekend. And for 4 years, I became really good at making excuses for why I wouldn't join. Oh, the wars will be over soon. Oh, those guys and gals, they got it. They don't need me. And I watched from the comfort of my living room as those wars unfolded. I watched as young men and women no different than me kicked in doors in the streets of Fallujah, in Kandahar, and places across the Middle East. One day, right before my senior year, I turned on the television and I saw the news that Pat Tillman was killed in Afghanistan. And here we are in Arizona, all practically in the shadows of the stadiums that Pat Tillman used to play in. You know, a football player who actually walked away from something of consequence to go serve his country. And I realized in that moment that I wasn't living the life that I wanted to live. I wasn't that man of conviction and integrity and courage that the 7-year-old version of me wanted to grow up and be. And so a few weeks later, I walked into a Marine recruiter's office, and I ended up enlisting into the United States Marine Corps. I was stationed in Southern California, and after several months of training, my unit was deployed to Iraq in 2007 as part of the surge. If you recall, this is when President Bush and Congress authorized a big surge of troops into Iraq to pacify what had become a really disintegrating situation on the ground. 2007 would become the deadliest year of the war in Iraq, and my unit was specifically stationed in a slice of Anbar province that was colloquially known as the Triangle of Death. It was a terrible time and place to live for 7 months. About 2 or 3 weeks in to that combat deployment, my unit was on a fairly routine mission. You know, we were in 3 Humvees rolling down some backcountry roads, trying to get somewhere in the middle of the night. And we were driving down this country road when all of a sudden I looked through my windshield and I saw the lead vehicle in our convoy cross a bridge, and suddenly it was outlined in an orange glow. And I remember my turret gunner dropping down into our Humvee, into the cab, and screaming, "They hit an IED, they hit an IED, they hit an IED." And we rolled off to the side of the road, and I opened the door, and I can still remember the smell of cordite filling my nostrils, even from 100 meters away. I can still remember the heat of that burning vehicle, even from 100 meters, right? I could feel the heat against the skin of my cheeks. And I watched as the lead door, the passenger side door of that Humvee opened up, and out tumbled this Marine. And that Marine was Sergeant Rosenberger. Sergeant Rosenberger was our squad leader. He was the one, right? He was the warrior. He was the one. He was the guy that had taught me everything I needed to know about being a Marine, about surviving combat. And I watched as he picked himself up, and he marched back across that bridge, and he marched right up to me, and he asked for a radio. And I looked down, and I saw that he had a really serious wound on his lower leg, life-threatening wound on his lower leg that he had somehow miraculously marched on as he came back to me. But he didn't ask for help when he approached me. He didn't ask for us to treat his wound and to take care of him. What did he ask for? He asked for a radio. Why did he ask for a radio? To call for help. Because he knew that the only thing that mattered was his sacred responsibility to us, which was to get us home, to get us out of there alive. And we handed him a radio. We got him the medical attention he needed. Unfortunately, one of our colleagues was killed in that truck, and we were lifted out on a helicopter. And about a week later, I was promoted to corporal, and I was given charge of that squad. And so 3 weeks into my first combat deployment, I find myself in charge of 13 Marines. And if I'd had a mirror to look into, I would have seen a scared little boy looking back who didn't know anything about leadership. And I had to grow up really fast. That learning curve was steep. And I learned a lifetime's worth of lessons about leadership over the course of the next 7 months. I could sit up here, I could talk all day about those leadership lessons. And I'll tell you, and it would only be scratching the surface of the lessons that I can still learn throughout my life. I by no means read the entire book in those 7 months, despite learning a lot. But I will boil down the lessons I learned into one simple truth that I believe with all of my heart. Leadership at its core is about love. Very simply put, leadership is about love. Leadership is about loving the people you lead. It's about truly caring for and understanding who they are, where they came from, where they want to go in their life. It's a heavy burden for a leader to actually invest that much emotionally into the people he or she leads. But this is the requirement of leadership. What happens when people feel loved, when people truly feel cared for? Well, they feel safe. This sense of caring unlocks this sense of safety. And every once in a while, I'll talk to business leaders, I'll talk to boardrooms, and I'll talk through this concept. And I've actually had people interrupt me and say, well, listen, I don't want my people to feel safe. When they feel safe, they feel complacent. And when they feel complacent, they get lazy. And they look at me like they caught me. And I just think to myself, I would never work for you. Who could possibly be inspired by that? And in fact, I actually think it's the opposite. I think that when people feel safe, that is when they find courage. I think about all the times on the battlefield, I saw, Marines run across open fields in machine gun fire to go grab another Marine who had gone down. They risked their lives despite the unthinkable danger. And they risked their lives because somehow they actually felt safe. Now that safety, that feeling of safety that they had on the battlefield under fire is of course relative. It's unlike anything many of you have ever experienced in your life, but that safety was born from the fact that they knew that if they went down in the middle of that field, there were 12 other Marines lined up to go and get them. And that provided them enough safety. That love, that esprit de corps, that brotherhood that people talk about, provided them that sense of safety that was able to unlock that courage that they found. That's where courage comes from, is that sense of love. And this is not something that you can fake as a leader. This is something that has to be genuine, caring for the people that you lead. I came back from Iraq. I was lucky. I had all my fingers and all my toes. And I was asked to try out for one of the Marine Corps Scout Sniper platoons. And so I did this tryout. It was about a week long. It was a fairly grueling test of mental, physical, and emotional stamina. And I was selected into the platoon. I was eventually sent to Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. Marine Sniper School's got one of the highest dropout rates in the Marine Corps. About 70% of my colleagues that we started the class with didn't pass. I was really fortunate. Despite tempting failure numerous occasions, I was able to graduate after about 12 weeks. And I was put into this 6-man Scout Sniper team. And shortly thereafter, we were deployed to Afghanistan in 2008. We were sent to a southern province called the Helmand Valley, where we were tasked with tracking and hunting Taliban and insurgent forces. It was an incredibly dangerous mission. We'd have to go out, into enemy-controlled territory almost every night. The mission at times was very vague, and it was wrought with, the potential for failure. And we encountered so many circumstances that taught me so much about myself and about human beings in general. But I think that the most important lesson that I walked away from Afghanistan with was this lesson of how principles impact organizations and leadership. If we think about our principles as like this moral compass, right? These principles behind me, these are universal human norms and expectations. It doesn't matter what continent you're born on. It doesn't matter where you grew up. Things like trust and integrity and respect are universally valued across mankind. They're not universally exercised. And in organizations, it's incumbent upon the leaders to make every single decision, take every single action through the lens of this compass. And when the stakes get higher, what's remarkable is that people start to find it really easy to make justifications for how they put other things ahead of these principles. It could be profit over integrity, market share over respect. It could be anything. And people start to make these justifications. And what's interesting is that as leaders, the people in our organizations reflect the values and the principles that they see. At minimum, they reflect what they see in their leaders. And so this starts to almost pervert the integrity of the entire organization. But if you're actually a leader with any shred of influence, people actually internalize what they see in their leaders. They bring away from work and back to home the values and the principles that they see in the leaders that they respect and they admire. And this influence is so tremendous. You have the opportunity to impact people's lives so incredibly. And what's so important to understand here is that the people that you lead, they don't care about the 99 times that you make a decision with integrity. They don't They expect that. That's table stakes for them. They care about that one time that you justify putting something else, whatever it is, personal gain, profit, any of those things, in front of one of these principles. And that one moment, that one decision, that one action erases everything else. You know, Warren Buffett put it best, right? It takes a lifetime to build a reputation. It takes a moment to erase it. Right? That's the burden of leadership. And I was lucky that in Afghanistan, I had a team leader, a one that I followed, who was one of the most principled men I've ever met. To this day, one of the most principled men that I've ever met. And so despite being in some of the most morally ambiguous situations on the planet, we never once took an action or made a decision that ever, for a moment, compromised our honor or integrity. And I've come to realize since leaving the Marine Corps, it's really hard to find that type of leadership. Now, I got out of the Marine Corps in 2009. I spent 4 years in. So many people spend so much more time. I had to reflect at the end of my 2 combat tours about what I wanted to do with my life. And after a lot of self-reflection, I determined that I didn't want war to define or consume who I was. And so I made this tough choice to get out in 2009. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. I did not know what I was going to do with my life. And so like anybody out here that didn't know what they were going to do with their lives, I decided I was going to go get an MBA, right? That's what you do. And so I got out, I took the GMAT, I started to apply for graduate school, and then I saw this one morning when I turned on the TV. This was one of the first images that came out after the Haiti earthquake in 2010. It was about 60 days after I left the Marine Corps. And I sat there transfixed all afternoon watching these images come back and forth, the hopelessness, the despair, the chaos, the destruction, all of those things. And I couldn't help but think how similar those images, those scenes were to my time, my experiences overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so after about a half day of watching all of this stuff unfold, I picked up the phone and I dialed one of those numbers that was scrolling across the bottom of the screen. And a nice old lady answered on the other line, and I said, "Ma'am, my name's Jake Wood. I just got out of the Marine Corps. I'm a sergeant. You know, I did all these schools. I've been to all these places. I'm really good at leading small teams in really chaotic environments, and I don't have anything to do for the next 7 months. I would love to go with your organization down to Port-au-Prince, free, and just help you to execute whatever it is that you need. I'll do any task." "Well, Mr. Wood, that's very nice of you, but why don't you just text us $10 and let us handle it?" Now, listen, I was very frustrated by that answer. Fast forward 10 years, I run a global humanitarian and disaster response organization, and if some idiot called me after the Haiti earthquake, I'd tell him the same thing, all right? But at the time, I wouldn't take no for an answer. And so I called a couple of friends that I had served with in the Marine Corps and my college roommate who was a Milwaukee firefighter, and we assembled this team of veterans and doctors and even a Jesuit priest that you see right there, and we crossed the border into Haiti about 4 days after the earthquake. You know, the bad joke is that 5 Marines, a gay doctor, and a Jesuit priest crossed the border into an earthquake. What could go wrong? And it was the most eclectic and motley crew that ever could have been assembled. But we did amazing things while we were on the ground. We began conducting these medical triage clinics in the hardest hit areas of Port-au-Prince, taking these doctors and going to parts of the city that other organizations either could not or would not go, and treating people. And what we realized while we were down there was that all we were doing was using the skills and experiences that the military had developed within us to help people on the worst day of their lives. And so we came back from that time in Haiti and we just said, let's do something with this. And we incorporated into a nonprofit organization that we called Team Rubicon. And we set out to build the best disaster response organization in the world. Our goal was to recruit as many of the 3 million men and women that were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and ask them to repurpose their skill and their experience to do the same. And over the course of the last decade, the last 10 years, we've recruited over 100,000 volunteers across the U.S., responded to over 400 disasters around the world and in communities here at home. And we've been able to tap into this incredible and powerful resource and build an organization that is faster and more efficient and more effective than any other organization out there. And as you saw in that video that they played before they introduced me, we discovered this really incredible impact of the work that we were doing, this unintended consequence. We learned that the men and women that we were recruiting, that we were giving this newfound mission to, were rediscovering these critical components that had been missing to some degree in their life. We were giving them purpose. We were giving them a community once again. We were giving them an identity, a feeling of self-worth that in some cases had been lacking since the last time that they had taken off the uniform. And those three things, purpose and community and identity, these are universal human needs. Every human in this auditorium right here needs these three things. But the men and women who have served under such extreme circumstances since they were 18 years old, it's this profound void in their lives when they get out. And we've been able to fill it by giving them this newfound mission. And so if you break down what Team Rubicon actually does, we assemble teams of people that have never met one another, deploy them to a community that they've never been to, assign them a series of tasks and objectives that are challenged by all of the realities of a post-disaster situation. Limited resources, limited information, the fog of war that of course exists on the field in these disaster zones. And over 400 times over the last decade, we've been able to execute that complex task with a consistency and professionalism and impact that is unrivaled by our peers. Now, if you think about that, that is the most challenging team-building situation on the planet. And we've been able to come up with a formula that helps us do it. And I'm going to close out by talking about some of the very simple, sometimes even obvious lessons that we've learned that are the keys to unlocking that along the way, okay? And the first thing that we set out to do, always, is to start with vision, right? Anybody out there that's a leader understands the importance of vision. You know, it's the first task of any leader. What's our vision? Where are we going? When I talk about it, I talk about writing the final chapter first. If you can't tell, we love storytelling at Team Rubicon. We love telling stories. And so if you think of your organization, your company, your team, as a story, as a book or a novel, that vision is the final chapter. It's the culmination of that plot line. What is the final chapter of that narrative arc? Is it you go public if you're a company? Is it you sell to a private equity firm? Is it you build the biggest building in your city? What is it? I don't know. You know what that is. But starting with that final chapter is key. And we'll talk more about storytelling here in a second. When we came back from Haiti, we said we wanted to build the best disaster response organization in the world. And if I'm going to be honest, that was pretty aggressive for a couple of idiots that had just gotten back from Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't know what we didn't know. But this is what we said we wanted to do. Now, there's a couple things that are really key about this vision. One, it's simple. There's no fancy fluff to this vision. It's easily understood by anybody that hears it. There's no ambiguity about what we want to accomplish. It's relatable. Anybody in our organization or anybody that was thinking about joining our organization could relate to what this meant. They could close their eyes and envision how they fit into this organization. They could imagine themselves as a character in this story. And the third thing that it was bold. Now, listen, it's kind of easy to make a bold vision. You say here's what we're going to do, and we're going to be the best in the world at it. Well, yeah, that's one way to do it. It's probably not the best way for most people in most organizations, but making a simple, relatable, and bold vision, that's the easy part, folks. Anybody can do this. This was not rocket surgery, okay? This was pretty easy. The hard part comes next, right? And to talk about that, I want to bring up another vision. So this is an airline. This airline's vision, since its inception, has become the world's most loved, most flown, and most profitable airline, okay? Now, I could probably tell this entire room that this was American Airlines. I could probably tell you it's Delta. I could probably tell you it's United Airlines. I probably could not convince you it's Spirit Airlines. But I could probably name any of the big three, and you would say, yeah, that makes sense. Who wouldn't want to be the most loved, most flown, most profitable carrier? Nobody, everybody would want that. When I tell people it's Southwest Airlines, they say, that makes sense. And why does it make sense? Because this is the reputation that Southwest has. They do things differently. They actually aspire to be the most loved, the most customer-friendly airline on the planet. And this is where visions get really hard for leaders. Because it's really easy, it would have been easy for United or American or Delta to craft that same vision. But the difference, the challenge, lies in what happens next. The challenge for leaders after crafting that vision is to align every single decision, every action, every resource behind what you said you wanted to accomplish. And so this is where it would have fallen apart for any of those big three airlines, because they obviously consistently make decisions that counter that pursuit of being the most loved. It seems sometimes that they do things to purposefully aggravate us. On the flip side, Southwest made really bold decisions very early on that has skewed the norms of the industry. Things that we all take for granted with Southwest now. You know, no checked bag fees, no change fees. These were revenue opportunities that they said, no, this creates friction in the customer experience, and we want to become the most loved. And so we're gonna make the tough choices to back that up. We're gonna allow our employees, our flight attendants, to have fun and crack jokes on the intercom. We're gonna allow our pilots to wear funny costumes on Halloween. These are choices that just contradicted the norm. But if they hadn't made them, then this vision would have fallen apart, and it wouldn't have amounted to serving as that guide star for all of the employees. Now, they went so far as to back this up that when Southwest went public on the New York Stock Exchange, what did they choose as their stock ticker symbol? Love, right? So that's a management team that puts its money where its mouth is. It's really easy. When you say you want to do something in your vision, it's really hard to back it up with every single decision, action, and resource. When we said we wanted to become the best disaster response organization in the world, that means that we could not allow ourselves to cut corners. We could never settle for anything less than being the best. And if we had ever said, oh, no, that's good enough, then people would have said, these guys aren't serious about building something that's going to be the best in the world. And every single day, that's the litmus test that we use in the work that we're doing. So this vision then should serve as like a bat signal to go and find the talent that you want on your team. It should be that flame that attracts, the moth. It's, that bat signal up in the sky in the clouds, right? This is how it's now time for you to go out and find those 9 that are going to help you to win the day, right? How do you go out and how do you find those individuals? I think most people get a little lazy here. They kind of take a come what may approach to going out and finding talent. They post a job description on Monster.com or whatever people use these days. Honestly, I don't even know. And they just go through the resumes that they get versus more proactively describing the types of people that have the DNA to enter their organization. When we first started recruiting people at Team Rubicon, our first job description had this as the very first line. We're looking for people, individuals, foolish enough to think they can change the world and smart enough to have a chance. This defined the type of person that we were looking for, the DNA of that individual. And we knew that a lot of people would read this line and say, man, these guys are taking themselves way too seriously. I want nothing to do with it. Well, good. Then we didn't have to waste our time culling through their resume out of the pile. But there was a whole different subset of people who read this and said, that is the type of organization I want to be a part of. What is that test? What is that phrase that defines the human beings in your organization, that defines those 9 that are going to help you win the day? This led the very first job description we ever posted. It's been on every single job description we have posted since, whether it's our chief financial officer or our accounts payable clerk. This is still defining who it is that we want in our organization. Now, the next thing we had to figure out is that as young entrepreneurs, it would have been really easy for us to just fall victim to our insecurity, our youth, and identify and select people who were measurably less talented or in some ways younger than us. I mean, we were young leaders, young entrepreneurs, and it would have been very easy to go out and just find people who were demonstrably less capable. Because that's what you do when you feel vulnerable as a leader. You go out and you try to identify people who really have no option but to follow you because they just know they're not as good as you, right? That's how you end up with the 80 and the 10 in organizations. Because what happens, what I said earlier was that the people in your organization will mimic what they see in their leaders. And so if you are doing this from the top, then the people that you hire, when it's time for them to build out their teams, what are they going to do? They're going to reflect what they saw you do. And they're going to go out and they're going to hire somebody that's measurably weaker and less talented than them. And so you get to the bottom of that rung and you have these hollowed out circles and you have these individuals who aren't capable of leading your organizations across the finish line. And so the alternative is to challenge yourself, to surround yourself with the types of individuals who are not going to be yes men, who are going to challenge you on a daily basis, who are measurably better than you and fill in your gaps. And this is really threatening for a lot of leaders. We probably all know, or maybe some of us are, that type of person who is threatened by being surrounded by talent. But boy, this is how you build incredibly strong and resilient organizations, to go out and get talent like this. And the challenge becomes then finding all of these super talented people and then ultimately aligning them to that vision that you have. How is it that you get these people to swallow their pride, swallow their ego, and submit themselves to something bigger than their talent and their resume and their fancy diplomas and degrees, right? How do you align those 9 to that vision? I think you do it with storytelling, to revisit that topic. I think this is one of the most underutilized tools in any leader's toolkit. Think about this for a moment. Since the moment mankind invented fire in the spoken word, we've sat around campfires and told stories. It's like it's a part of our DNA. We tell stories about our day. We tell stories about our past. We craft legends to explain things that we can't explain using reason and logic. We tell stories because when we close our eyes at night, whether we think about it or not, we imagine ourselves being a part of some story that's bigger than the life that we're currently living. We all want to be a character in some hero's journey, or we want to be the hero ourselves. And as a leader, if you think about your organization as a story or as a book, we've already talked about that final chapter being the vision, your employees, the people on your team, are the characters in that book. And if you treat them like unnamed characters that have no plot impact found on page 56, then that's how they'll show up to work. They'll be among the 80 and the 10. But if you make everybody in your organization feel like they're a named character, like they have impact on that plot line, like they are crucial to the development of that final chapter, that's how they show up to work. They show up every single day trying to write their own narrative, trying to write themselves into the history of your organization. That's how you align people, the most talented people that you can find, to submit themselves to that higher calling, that vision that you have for your organization. Think about how you use storytelling in your organizations to accomplish that. And so now you have your vision and you have your team, right? You've found your 9. Now what do you have to do? You have to create a culture that counts. And what do I mean by counts? What's that mean? The way we talk about it at Team Rubicon is that culture guides decisions in the absence of orders. That's what I mean by making a culture that counts. When people haven't been told explicitly what to do, how do they implicitly know what to decide or how to act? That's culture. Whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision, it's the culture that's getting them there. And what is it? It's the intangible sum of all these different things we think about in our organizations. Some of them people like to just say, oh, it's the benefits package and the perks that you offer. It's having ping pong tables at the office or bring your dog to work. It's like, well, it's a perk. It's not culture. It's also the language you use. It's the way you treat one another. It's the way you celebrate one another's accomplishments. It's the amount of candor that you use in your conversations. It's the stories and artifacts that you hold sacred within your organization. It's how you celebrate anniversaries. It's the policies that you have. It's the policies that you don't have that all together come and create this culture. In some ways, it's indefinable. In some ways, it's immeasurable. But in all ways, it has impact on your organization. We follow a very simple formula at Team Rubicon for how we build and maintain our culture. And I'll walk you through it very quickly. It starts with 3 things that we've already talked about. It starts with that ethical leadership, that moral compass that I said earlier. If you aspire to have a moral organization, it requires moral leadership at the top. Simple as that. End of sentence. Then it's vision. If culture guides decisions in the absence of orders, people have to know where they're trying to go. Then it's people. When you're hiring people that reflect the values that you want to see. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't scale, right? You might be able to build a culture or a team, and through the first 50 people, you can build that culture just with the people that you hire. But over time, after 50 people, certainly after 100 people, that doesn't scale. You can't actually build culture through that way. You can destroy it by picking the wrong people, but you can't build it. And so how do you build it from there once you have these three things locked in? Well, the next phase is values. Now, what's the difference between values and those principles that I spoke about earlier? I talked about those principles like integrity and trust and respect. Those are universal human norms. It doesn't matter where you grew up, those are universally human valued. Values are the manifestation of those things in your organization. Something like trust, universally valued. But trust is going to be reflected differently in your organization as it is in your organization. Respect, universally valued, regardless of where you were born. It's going to look differently in your organization as in yours. So understanding how these principles uniquely manifest themselves in your company is critical. And that's how you move from, company values that are simple words like trust and respect and integrity and into phrases and language that actually reflect what that means in your organization. Now, parallel to this, you have to put in place all those other mechanics of a company that people often think about. The policies, the practices, the pay and reward structure. And just like vision, this is where people get it wrong. Because it's really easy to craft value statements that you think people want to hear. And often what a leader does is they go to Google, and they Google values, and then usually Google's company values pop up, and they're like, oh, those sound really cool. Control copy, control paste, different logo. Hey, here are our company values. Well, it doesn't work like that. But even if you could do that and people would buy into it, if you don't have every single one of these things around that cycle, those practices and policies and all of that, if they don't reflect those values, if they in fact disagree with those values, then everything falls apart. You don't have alignment between what you say you value and what you actually put into practice. What do I mean by that? If you say that you trust your people, right? We want to treat everybody like adults and we trust our people. Hey, sounds like a great value. Who wouldn't want to be trusted, right? But then your finance department says, well, but you have to keep a $3 receipt for lattes that you buy on the road because frankly, we just don't trust you to spend the company resources wisely. That's a disconnect. And it might seem minor, but it begins to erode the value that people place in that culture. You might say, we treat everyone like family here at Acme Corp. Oh, that's cool. Who doesn't want to be a part of a family? But then you don't offer paid paternity leave. Or you offer the bare minimum insurance. You don't extend insurance benefits to family members. Oh, well, if you don't treat my family like family, then how far does this culture actually extend? And people start to just say, nah, you're not actually backing up what you say that you value in this culture and in this company. Now, ultimately, these things lead to actions and outcomes. And I had a mentor once say that every single outcome in an organization has a culture that's perfectly designed to achieve it. So if you're consistently getting bad outcomes, if you have a department that's consistently underperforming, go and diagnose the culture. If you have a department or a team that is just crushing it time and time again, go and figure out what it is that they are doing culturally that is leading to that outcome and figure out how you can replicate it across the enterprise. And then again, finally, I said, how do you actually scale this? Well, we talk about scaling it through storytelling. And when we talk about storytelling, we mean all of these other components of storytelling. We're talking about crafting the history of the organization. We're talking about creating the artifacts that people place value in. Like this uniform right here is the gray shirt. It's the iconic uniform of Team Rubicon. It is the most sacred artifact that we have. We refer to our volunteers as gray shirts to reflect that because they're our most important resource. Things like that are what create value in these organizations. Now, the final thing I'll say here is that these are the values that we have at Team Rubicon. They don't mean anything to you. You'll read these, you'll scratch your head, and you'll say, I don't even know what that means. And I'll say two things. One, this is actually a photograph of our values on our wall at our headquarters in Los Angeles. We had to have a raging debate about whether or not we put our values on the wall. Because too often leaders craft values, they put them on the wall, or they print them out on a piece of paper and they put them above the urinal in the men's bathroom. And they assume, well, if it's above the urinal, everybody's going to see it and they're going to read it. And that's true, but it does not mean that they're going to internalize it. And so getting the values off the wall is the most important and final step. Figuring out how to inject this into every interaction, every single day in the organization. And the test of whether or not you've been successful there is whether these values enter the everyday language of the people in your organization. When people are debating a decision and they're invoking these value statements in their arguments, that's when you know that people have actually internalized what you want them to do. This is when you know that it's actually guiding decisions in the absence of orders. And so if you've done all these things, if you have crafted the right vision, if you've gone out and you've built this team of these 9, right? And it's not literally 9 people, it's the type of individuals that you go out and recruit. And you've aligned them to that vision, and you've created a culture that's going to guide their actions in the absence of orders. Now it's that most crucial step that you can take as a leader, where you have that temptation to stand in front of that team and make all the decisions and direct all of the action. It's time, in fact, to just step back. Your job has already been done. It's time for you to empower the people that you employ to go out and execute on your behalf. And I'll tell a very quick story for how this worked for me recently, how I was reminded of its importance. This is a photo from Hurricane Harvey. You saw some of this in that video they led with. We put boats in the water, rescue teams in the water after the Houston Police Department called for private citizens to do so. Now, what's interesting here is that Team Rubicon had no boats, right? We didn't have a boat rescue capability or program internally. So this was not anything that we regularly have done or did. And over the course of the first 48 hours of Hurricane Harvey, I watched as these floodwaters were rising, and I was at our headquarters in Los Angeles. Our team at our National Operations Center in Dallas was working literally 24 hours around the clock, managing our initial response efforts. And I kept thinking to myself, we should buy boats. We should buy boats. But we had this very disciplined system for how we would launch new capabilities, for how we would figure out we would do something new in a disaster zone, because this is rife with danger and risk to the organization. So I kept thinking, I should make this really tough leadership choice. I should eschew this policy that we have around launching a new capability without the research and the development. And I agonized over this for about 5 hours. And finally I said, we should get boats. And so I put my foot up on my desk and I picked up my phone and I dialed my field operations director in Dallas and I said, David, get me boats. And it was like my General Patton moment. And David responded, Jake, we've already bought 6 boats. They'll be in the water within an hour. And I realized in that moment that we had built the right culture because David felt safe to make the right decision in the absence of my orders. He felt empowered to do what he thought was right, even though it meant doing something that was technically wrong, according to our organization's guidance, right? And that's when I knew that we had hired the right people, that we had the right vision, and that we had a culture that was guiding those decisions in the absence of orders. And so when you think about other organizations that have this slow, lumbering, agonizing decision loop where information goes up and it's debated and agonized over and questions go back down and other information goes back up before people ever figure out how to make a decision and the situation actually has changed, organizations that can do this well have this decision loop that is just faster. And it creates this speed, this flexibility, and this resilience in organizations that helps us to conquer that chaos and uncertainty that we started with at the beginning. So, ladies and gentlemen, my time is up. I want to say a couple of things. I'll say one, thank you to Procore. We launched a rebuild capability in Houston, Texas after Hurricane Harvey. We've rebuilt 40 homes in Florida. We've rebuilt 504 roofs in Puerto Rico. We've rebuilt 70 homes now in Houston, Texas. And all of that has been managed through the Procore platform. They've been just an amazing partner. And so I want to thank you. I say a thank you to the Procore team. The final thing I'll say is that we are recruiting and training these military veterans to work in the construction industry. And we're putting them to work for year-long fellowships to rebuild these homes for people that have lost everything, people that society is just kind of pushing aside and saying, hey, good luck, figure it out. And I don't think that's fair, and we're addressing that. But on the back end of these fellowships, we have talented and experienced military veterans that are going to be looking to work for your companies. So come and find our booth in the Expo Center and figure out how we can partner together. Thank you guys, and enjoy your week in Phoenix.